a word about our presenter, not that she needs an introduction, it's just that I'm honored to moderate her session this evening and gave myself the liberty to say a few words. Dr. Roberta Ervine teaches at St. Nerses Armenian Seminary, and I use the word teach in the Armenian Church's understanding. She teaches teachers. She excavates manuscripts, ancient texts, and writings, brings them to life, and using the tools of our great church teachers, our church fathers, she equips each one of her students based on the true essence of the Armenian Church, including her history, culture, theology, art, scripture, and liturgy. So once again, it is my honor to open her class this evening, which focuses on the overview of the changes in Armenia during the time period between the Islamic takeover and the end of the Pakraduni kingdom. Dr. Ervine.
All right, I think you can hear me now. Can you hear me? Okay, very good. All right, so during the time period that we're going to be talking about in this little series, Armenians had to reinvent themselves multiple times. And for the first 150 years of this period, they had to achieve these reinventions of self without the benefit of the kind of structure that we today would refer to as a sovereign state. So it's fortunate that Armenians already had a good deal of practice and had become very resourceful in such circumstances. As you remember, there had been no unified Armenian state since 428, and we're now in the 7th century, ready to start the 8th. Of course, though, the physical land itself and the Armenian population, for the most part, remained where they had always been. And so some of the ancient Armenian clans and provinces continued to be powerful players, no matter who was the larger power dominating the region. It was kind of like I hear that the screen is not being shared. Yeah, of course. So we're going to have a rescue. Stand by, as they used to say in the days when TV was new. Stand by. Okay, here's that. That works. Thank you so much, Arpi. And from the Armenians' point of view, living on their land with various powers coming and going was something like being the mountains over whose peaks cloud formations pass at various times. They come, they go, the mountain remains. And so at the outset, as far as Armenians were concerned, Islamic domination was just another cloud formation. It took a while for them to realize that it is not. And that in fact, the Islamic invasion overturned everything in the region. People who knew the rules of the old balancing games that had to be played between the Byzantine and the Persian empires were suddenly looking at a completely new situation, whose rules they didn't know and with whose game pieces they weren't familiar. I don't know about you, have you ever had these dreams where you walk onto a stage and you realize there's a play going on and you don't have the script and nobody told you who you are in the play and you've never seen any of these people before and the curtain is going up? It was like that, I think, for Armenians right after the Islamic invasion. And so as Armenian groups are trying to calculate how long this Islamic hegemony might last, there was a lot of maneuvering as each little area, each little local elite tried to work out what might be the most advantageous position for them to occupy towards these newcomers. I imagine it cost people a lot of sleep at night. And those who were able to find a rapprochement with the Muslims at the beginning made out best in the early years. But no one could really foresee that Islam would continue to be a dominant, if not the dominant, force in this region for the next 1,300 years and counting. And one doubts whether anyone on the ground actually appreciated the way that the Islamic power itself was going to change and fragment and reshape over that time period along the lines of many things, along the lines of internal rivalries, along the lines of new conquests, as they adopted and absorbed new ethnicities, new customs, new ways of thinking, the power would change. And so the situation kept changing for people who, like the Armenians, were minority groups within the greater Islamic sphere. So at the beginning of our period in the 8th century, 50 or so years have elapsed since the first Islamic incursions into the Armenian highlands. And the Armenian church was processing not just those invasions, but also the other tremendous shocks that they had undergone in the 7th century. As we already mentioned, at mid-century, Armenia lost not only the Persian political counterweight to Byzantium, but they also lost their Persian cultural counterpart in the invasion. They lost their independence. They lost a large chunk of their cultural identity. They lost a partner on whom, for good or bad, they could rely. And not long before the trauma of the invasions, as we spoke about last semester, Armenia had also lost its closest brother in the Caucasus, the Georgian Church. And that had created all kinds of cultural havoc in Armenia's northernmost region, where the population was mixed linguistically, culturally, ethnically. It was a lot to digest and to assimilate on the level of church relations and also on the level of political policy. And even though they didn't know it at the time, Armenians would have a little less than 50 years in which to make these adjustments, in which to lick these wounds before things changed again. And clans who had chosen to side with their new Islamic overlords also had just a little less than 50 years to enjoy their favored status as the invaders began to establish themselves in the region and needed their Armenian allies while they learned how one governs in the Caucasus, which was a far cry from the Arabian Peninsula or Mesopotamia. But by the end of the 7th century, and we're going to look at this in more detail in a couple of weeks, things were definitely changing, and not for the better from the Armenian point of view. Towards the end of the 7th century, the Armenian church found itself kind of unexpectedly under attack by a new wave of accusations and discord with the Byzantine religious establishment. And in fact, the close of the 7th century would be a period of extreme political turbulence in Byzantium as well, which kind of pulled out from under Armenians' feet this little rug of security that they had had in the hope that their Byzantine Christian neighbors, their former allies, could be actually reliably helpful to them. It became clear that this was not the case. And you kind of see why. In Byzantium, the century closed with 6 emperors succeeding one another in short order, including this guy. You may never have heard of him, but when you hear his name, you may recognize something about it. He was called Philippicus Bardanes. If Bardanes sounds slightly to you like Vartan, there's a reason for that. Philip Vartan Bardanes reigned for barely 2 years, I believe. It wasn't a lot. He came to a bad end as well, but we can't get into these lovely dramatic fraught stories about emperors, or we'll never get through our semester, much though I would love to. Except we should note that Bardanes was only one of 20 ethnic Armenians to rule the Byzantine Empire. So there's a constant thread for several centuries in Byzantium of Armenian leadership in one way or another. In any case, this new harshness towards Armenians from the West, and at some point maybe we'll talk about some of the accusations that were being leveled at Armenians, some of the anti-heretical tracts that were written against Armenians as heretics. But maybe we won't have time, I'm not sure. Anyway, this new harshness, this atmosphere of anti-Armenianness from the West began to be matched in the last decade of the 7th century by equal harshness from the Islamic side. And as we'll see later, this is partly because there was a dynastic change in the caliphate. There was a move away from the relatively easy terms that Armenia had enjoyed as favored citizens of the caliphate. And so, stuck between two now hostile powers, it was, to say the least, a really difficult time to be in charge of anything Armenian, whether it was seculars. And Armenians who had been in favor of the Arabs at the time of the invasions 50 years earlier, thinking that they were potentially better rulers than the Byzantines had been, suffered a very rude awakening at the end of the century, after an initial honeymoon generation. And Armenians who had continued to rely on the Byzantines as a source of stability on the basis of past friendship, also found themselves feeling like they had just been hung out to dry. So, how do you navigate an ever-changing, often hostile in multiple directions situation? In other words, the Catholicoses of the 8th century face a very daunting task. And we'll talk more about that momentarily. But first, I want to go back a little bit and see where we were at the end of the lecture series that we did last semester. Because we left off that time at the beginning of the Islamic takeover, which is going to come to look like this, spreading everywhere from Spain, the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, all the way over far beyond the Caspian into Asia. And just as this was becoming the reality, the power in the caliphate passed into the hands of the Abbasid dynasty in the middle of the 8th century. And if you look at the map, you can see what used to be one color, what used to be simply the holdings of the caliphate, no longer is. Across the course of the 8th century, Islamic power diversifies. And so while areas like Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, Armenia, and what had been Persia, part of it, remain under the control of the caliphate proper, other pieces of what had been caliphate proper are now kind of farmed out to the care of other Islamic groups that technically owed allegiance to the caliphate, but that allegiance might fluctuate from time to time. And so now, instead of one Islamic State, you have at least 5. And we're going to see what that looks like in terms of Armenia. The changes in who controls what area of the Islamic world, it's rapidly becoming an Islamic world rather than a caliphate, more of a confederation of states that belong to different groups rather than to that centralized empire. It didn't affect Armenia directly in terms of boundaries. As you can see, Armenia is still within the green, controlled directly by the Abbasid government. However, it did change the structures of power around Armenia as other Muslim groups began to take over parts of what had been one entity. And as time goes on, there will be more and more different regimes to take into account. For an Armenian hierarch or a political person, there are that many more plates to keep in the air at the same time because you have to have some grasp of what's going on in all of these neighboring places. More languages to learn, more customs to absorb, more complications to travel, more complex relationships across what had once been a relatively homogeneous landscape. It was a challenge. And to give you an idea of what it meant to be an inhabitant of Armenia's home regions in this time period, I want to do a quick map tour with you, showing how the political borders of the Armenian highlands change over the 300 and a little bit years that we will be looking at in this series. And here we have a great advantage because, of course, nobody lives 300 years. So the changes in the landscape are really only seen by people like us who are looking at it from a long distance, who have the benefit of people who have drawn careful maps. We have the benefit of studies that have been done. We have the benefit of historical publications. We're going to kind of put that aside for a minute, and we're going to pretend that we can have a panoramic view of the whole of this 300-year period. So let's just, for fun, say, your family roots, your imaginary family roots, maybe for some of you it's true family roots, are in or near the town of Khalat on the north shore of Lake Van. If you think of Lake Van as a kind of a little goat that's lying down facing east, it has its feet tucked under it, it has its little head sticking up, and then on the back of the goat towards the west is Khalat. It's a lovely town. If you go online, you'll find pictures of it in the snow as the village or the town of Akhlat now in Turkey. So let's say you live there. In the early 8th century then, your family would be part of the Muslim province. You see that each section of the map has a Roman numeral on it. So out near the Caspian Sea, you have Roman numeral 1. That's Armenia 1. Up towards the Georgian border, nearer to the Black Sea, you can see there's a Roman numeral 2. And down below in the orange part, you see the Roman numeral 3. 1, 2, and 3 for the Muslim government were considered to be Armenia. Three different provinces, but all part of the same Armenia, all part of the same ethnic realm as far as they were concerned. And of course, thereby hang some issues that have held over into today. Okay, so you have an Armenia configuration that goes from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea just a little bit. It includes 2.5 of Armenia's Great Lakes. It includes Sevan and Van, not so much Urmia. And that's a sizable piece of property. And you can see that your people in Khalat are not on the border of anything. They are right pretty much front and center in this large province. So when the Caliphate appoints a governor of Armenia, which it does more than once, and we'll be introduced to one of these governors later today, in the 8th or the 9th century, that functionary is responsible for a very large amount of land. So here you are, beginning of the 8th century, living in Khalat, nice and secure in a totally Armenian area. And then, assuming that your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren have chosen to go on living in Khalat in the 9th century, look what has happened. Now, instead of that lovely big orange area, you have a much reduced orange area, which is pretty much vertical, like a slice out of the middle of what had been Armenia. And biting into, encroaching into the west side of that orange area is a yellow thing, a yellow piece of territory. You can see above the yellow territory is a pink area called Dyke. And below the yellow area is a pink area called Daron. And when you think back to Armenia in the 5th century, Dyke and Daron are pretty much connected. These are the home provinces of Grigor Lusavoric and his family, Mesrop Mashtot and his clan. Now, separating Dyke from Daron is something called the Qaysid Emirate, ruled by Arabs from the northern Arabian Peninsula. They have been able to take control of this land, taking bites out of the Armenian highlands in the east and in the north and in the south. That means that our beautiful Khalat is no longer in the middle of an Armenian area. Instead, it's a border town. It's on the edge near that emirate. And as you can see to the west, the Byzantines have successfully pushed into Islamic areas a little bit, taking away bits of what's going to be Cilicia. And that whole border area is in fact fluid. It's like a waterbed in this time. You push on it one way, it moves a little bit. Push on it the other way, it moves that way. And so the people who live along the Byzantine border and the people who live in places like Khalat that are on the edge of new entities are well advised to learn enough Arabic to make life comfortable. And in fact, as you can see, we're going to take a close-up look at that section in the square. The section that's in the square is the big brown blob in the middle here. There are no more massive Armenian provinces. Instead, by the time you get to the late 9th century, there is that very strangely shaped entity in brown that is known to history as the Bagratid Kingdom of Greater Armenia. And as you can see from looking at Lake Sevan there in the right, you can see that it pushes way up into what we would consider now to be Georgia, and it's wrapped around, it has like a scarf around it, of provinces with Georgian sounding names, although they are not yet united into Georgia as we think of it. So clearly, just looking at this map, you think, oh my goodness, whoever is king of Greater Armenia, of the brown blob, is going to have to pursue a foreign policy that takes those northern provinces into account. He's probably going to try and push up that way and take more of it in order to create a more defensible region for himself. And then as you look down towards the bottom, you don't even see Lake Van. And Khalat does not fall within the borders of Bagratid Greater Armenia. Khalat is outside. In that province at the bottom, you see the peachy province called Vaspurakan. If you keep going down, you'll come to the lake, and Khalat is on the left end of that orange. The province of Vaspuragan actually wraps around Lake Van in this time period, kind of like a ring. And then as you look at this map some more, you think, wait a minute. I see the Kaysid Emirate on the left, it's pink. But what are those things on the right? You see there's a dark orange area. It's called Dabil. But in the top left of it is the city of Ervine. What has happened? Just like there was an intrusion into the Armenian highlands by the Kaysid Emirate on the west, there is also one on the east. How did it get there? Like we said, it's small. It's centered on Ervine. It calls itself Dabil, which is a variant on the name Ervine. And it got its start because Ervine had been the administrative center of the Caliphate's representatives in Armenia when there was this big area. And in the 9th century, it still housed Muslim bureaucrats, their entourages, and other people, Muslims, who have moved into the area. And the Emirate of Dabil was looking to expand south and east too. You can see the striped areas. Dabil is claiming both of those areas as its own territory. They're in dispute between Dabil and the province of Gochten and the province of Vaspuragan. And so you can imagine that people in those striped areas are not feeling very comfortable about this situation. In addition, Dabil's small but rather aggressive emirate was very problematic for Armenians because Ervine was also the traditional center of the Armenian church. And I'll show you a picture of it later. The Catholicosal Palace and the cathedral, the Maibajar, are in Ervine. That presents a problem. Although the church leadership would find it really difficult psychologically to leave behind their traditional seat entirely, the situation, as you look at it, is obviously untenable over the long term unless somehow the brown blob of Bagratid land is able to expand to include it. A couple of generations later, you can kind of orient yourself again around the lake. Your relatives at Khalat would be included in the newly established kingdom of Vaspuragan. But wait, there was a greater Armenia kingdom of the Bagratid kings. Now what is the kingdom of Vaspuragan? Well, Vaspuragan's rulers are relatives of the Bagratids in Greater Armenia. They're also their rivals. As you can see, there's a significant border area in stripes up near Dabil, which is in contest between Vaspuragan and Greater Armenia. And Khalat itself is in an area that Vaspuragan was only recently able to snatch away from the Kaysid Emirate. So for people in Khalat, like your family, now there's a little bit of a breathing room. There's a little bit of Armenian territory. However, this Armenian territory now has a significant population of Muslims in it. And even though Vaspuragan was successful in pushing away the Kaysid Emirate enough to get some air in the room, it was really like, have you played this game? Have you ever played whack-a-mole? I think it's a great game. If you hit one, another one comes up somewhere else. You can also play this game with your cat, but once the cat gets really good at it, it ceases to be fun for you. Anyway, neither here nor there. The point being that although the Armenians of Vaspuragan pushed back one emirate, there are new Muslim entities, new Muslim populations springing up in other areas as well. And so the whole west shore
I think we're having technical difficulties. Just give us a few moments. We apologize for this. Once again, hello everyone. We're having a technical difficulty. We'll be right with you in a couple of minutes. Please stay tuned. There's more to come.
All right. Okay, so I hope everyone had time to get popcorn or whatever else. Hopefully this takes care of it. Okay, so new Muslim entities are cropping up in various places, and this is going to continue on. And if we wanted to take a little closer look at one example of how fragmented this could get, you can see up in the upper right corner, there's the province of Sunik. It's kind of in its own color there. It's an independent entity. It is not part of all the ground surrounding it that belongs to the Daguerreotypes. Okay, where do we get that from? Good. Okay. Arpi gets a prize. Also, she gets 3,000 steps just from this presentation. Okay, so we're going to take a little test case. We're going to look at that province of Sunik. Everybody's familiar with Sunik nowadays because it's been kind of on the front lines as far as the war in Karabakh is concerned. We're going to take a close-up look at it. See Vaspuragan in the south. That peachy color stays the same. You see dark orange W. You see that now Sunik itself is a contested territory. And then you see that up above it are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 provinces, and down below it are another 2. So what was one big area has divided itself up. And if we were to look at this process more closely, which we're going to do in another slide, we would see that the principle of entropy, which means that everything tends towards disorder, is not just a principle of physics, it's also a principle of geography and politics in this time period. And so here we have comparative pictures of what this little province of Sunik looks like in the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th century. And you can see how much it changes. The different colors indicate different controlling families. And so what in the 10th century is divided into 2 large areas. In the 11th is divided into 4. In the 12th is divided back into 3. And then in the 13th is divided again into 4, but they're not the same 4. So for people who are living in this area, life can be very complicated and very interesting. So what 150 years earlier has been effectively the province of Armenia I is now a dozen different entities under the control of 3 or 4 families. And then finally, that was just an example. Let's pan back to the bigger picture. Finally, at the end of the same time period that we are discussing, what do we see? Where is the greater kingdom of Armenia? It's no longer there. Where is the kingdom of Vaspuragan? It's no longer there. Where is the principality of Sunik? It actually looks pretty good for the moment. But what is all of that purple that has taken over the space where the greater kingdom of Armenia used to be, where the kingdom of Vaspuragan used to be? All of that purple is the Byzantine Empire. So where is beautiful Khalat at the start of the 11th century? It's within the Byzantine Empire, which has swept in temporarily, as we're going to see, doing away with Dyke, Daron, Kayseri Emirate, engulfing everything that was left of Armenia. And this great tidal wave of Byzantine territorial resurgence is going to bring a large Armenian population under direct rule from Constantinople. And so Khalatetsis, who up until now have spoken good Armenian and good Arabic, are also going to have to learn good Greek. It also means that there will be Armenians swept into the bureaucracy of Byzantium. It also means that there is going to be a massive exodus of population from this area as people have finally kind of had enough. It also means that there's going to be members of the royal household from both Vaspuragan and Greater Armenia who have been cut loose from their home moorings, so to speak, and kind of ejected out into the greater world. So what happens? What about the center of the Armenian church in a time when there is no Armenia at all, fragmented or not, except the province of Sunni, which is fiercely clinging to its independence? We are going to be looking very closely at the special pressures the Armenian church hierarchy faced in this new situation. So, before we go on, I want to just recap the period in a nutshell. We're going to go quickly through the 5 slides and have a look. Go from a kingdom with intrusions to 2 rival kingdoms with more intrusions and much more fragmentation, to nothing. That basically is the trajectory for this 300 years. But I should also add one more thing. None of these changing entities is isolated from the others. Here you see a map, sketchy map of the trade routes that connected the parts of the known world at the end of our time period. There's a lot of movement going on. There's a lot of goods being transported from place to place. There's a lot of customs and goods being moved all across this map. And here, a slightly different, slightly later map, is a close-up of the area. Of course, okay, I probably wouldn't draw this any better. So you have the Caspian Sea, you have the Black Sea. The Caspian Sea gets to be really big. Caspian Sea, the Black Sea up top left, and then you have the Mediterranean to the side, that's showing all the Greek islands and Cyprus and things. And you can see, even within the area of Armenia, there are roads, there are main routes that go through that area. Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, and assorted others are crisscrossing one another's populations, buying and selling and cross-pollinating. And people are brought together by trade and cross-cultural marriages, and so they learn, as one does, about one another's faith, language, habits, foods, fashions. And so you have the Armenian highlands becoming, in this time period, a kind of a melting pot, if you like. A place where Armenian princes might have Arabic or Persian names. Again? No. What is happening? What is happening with this? It's not the computer this time. I don't know, but it may just be this. Maybe there's something with the clicker that it doesn't like, because the meeting seems to still be, the Zoom seems to still be on. Okay. Armenian ethnic princes will have names in Arabic or Persian. Like this very Armenian prince, you can see his tombstone here is written in Armenian letters, but his name is Prince Hassan Jalal. And as you notice, the decorations on his tombstone are also syncretic, shall we say, bringing together motifs from various places. People would borrow noble titles and vocabulary from these languages. For example, one of the kings, several of the kings actually, of Greater Armenia are going to take the title Shahanshah, and they're going to dress in Islamic garments, at least when they're getting dressed up for official events. This is also a period in which many of Armenia's most famous architectural monuments were built. So you have the first buildings at Halvat and at its sister monastery, Sanahin, being built in this time period by the Bagratids, specifically by the Bagratid queen. The first buildings in Datev, in Sunni, are built in this time period, as well as, naturally, the great cathedral at Ani. I like this picture because it has a person included for scale. And also Akhtamar's Holy Cross, the seat of the Ardzrumid kings and for a time of the Catholicosate. And not only is this strangely fragmented period productive in architecture, it's also productive of great works of literature, art, and spirituality. The Queen Moke Gospel, made in the 9th century, but then it was named for its third owner, who was Queen Moke, Queen of Kingagi, who we just saw in the other picture. This time period also produces very famous relics, like this cross, processional cross, battle cross belonging to Ashot Yergat, Ashot II, who ruled Greater Armenia from 914 to 925 and earned his name well. You may remember it from seeing it at the Met Armenia exhibition, if you had a chance to go to that. So, who gets to oversee, or who has to oversee, the Armenian church in this period of increasing fragmentation and stunning artistic achievement? We're going to come back to this list next time in more detail. We're going to put the hierarchs in a broader context of their political and ecclesiastical contemporaries. But even now, just looking at this quickly, we can see certain interesting things about how successfully or not the Armenian church will be able to cope with the issues of their Islamized reality. All of the Catholicos' names on this slide that are in red note men who reigned for under 5 years. And so you can see that where things begin relatively stable at the beginning of the 8th century, by the time you get just past the middle of it, it's a disaster. It's a train wreck. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Catholicos in the last couple of decades. This is not enough time for a long and fruitful reign. This is not enough time to become a builder. This is not enough time to develop a pastoral care program for the people who are in your care in all of these different jurisdictions. What does this do to the stability of the church administration? What does it do to the stability of spiritual teaching and life and education? And what on earth could have happened to make the leadership of the church at the end of this century so very precarious? And of course, we'll come back and answer those questions. And when you compare this train wreck of an 8th century with what comes in the 9th, you look at it and you go, oh, this is so much better, provided that these guys are actually good, and they were. You have a time now when things might get done, when hierarchs are in office long enough to repair, to build, to initiate, to organize. And although the century does begin and end with shorter type reigns, Pope Sept I gets barely a decade, Mashlos I gets just a year. Everyone in between is in place for between 2 and 3 decades. And it's perhaps no surprise that this is the period when the Bagratids are consolidating their power, achieving kingship, and holding on to the reins of everything. It's also no surprise that unlike the preceding century, the 9th sees a huge spurt in economic development, vastly increased standard of living, to the point that Armenian economic situation is described with awe by some of the people who witnessed it and saw the dramatic rise in Armenia's status and fortunes. And I may read you a couple of those glowing descriptions at some point. So we have a century of instability, a century of stability, and then look what happens in the 10th with the leadership of the Armenian Church. As you can see, the Catholicosate not only has 3 incumbents with very short reigns, but apparently the Catholicosal center has to relocate 3 different times. Once to Akhtamat, that's a story in and of itself. Once to Ervine, I bet most of us have not heard of Ervine, not a household name. And then finally, for the century's last few years, the Catholicos sits in Ani, the Bagratid capital. And then there is nothing after that. So at the midpoint in the 11th century, it's all over. In other words, the Armenian church in this century is on a roller coaster ride. I don't know whether it's carrying the faithful along with it on the ride or whether it's trying to keep up with them. But the gargantuan task of shepherding people across multiple ever-changing boundaries in multiple ever-changing cultures, in multiple languages, must have required the heads of the church to develop a complex bureaucracy, to keep track of the needs of all these people, supply them with clergy, advocate on their behalf with various governments. And that's only going to get more complicated as time goes on and greater numbers of Armenians move out into the larger world, a process that is by no means over. It has continued until the Catholicosate of today has to try to meet somehow the spiritual needs and desires of a worldwide multicultural, multilingual, multi-generational Armenian diaspora with a quarter of the clergy that they once had. So, to all of you clergy, thank you extremely much for what you were trying to do. But with this geographical and hierarchical background in place, we are ready to begin adding faces to these facts. And one of the beautiful things about studying this time period is realizing how many prodigious people existed in these days. We are going to meet extraordinary people who seem to have arisen in order to meet these extraordinary challenges. And some of them inspired and lighted the way for many people by means of their shining sanctity, devotion, self-sacrifice. And others of these prodigious people you would not want to meet in a dark alley. It's like this is a time of extremes, the extremely wonderful, the extremely horrible, and a lot of people in the middle that we don't know as much about. All kinds of astonishing people who are doing their very best across this time period to wrestle out of this situation some kind of positive momentum for Armenians, including, of course, themselves. And it will be very difficult to decide how many of their stories to tell, because the pool of remarkable happenings and remarkable people in this time period is huge. And so as a foretaste of the kinds of characters we will encounter, I would like to close this evening with a kind of extended meet and greet for us with one of Christian Armenia's greatest leaders ever. Let's see, where is, I had a picture of him, maybe I don't. I don't. Which is actually okay because there are no true pictures of him. This is just like an imaginative depiction of him. So anyway, you can imagine his face for yourself. His name is Sahak III. He is the man who fate or divine will, however you want to look at that, chose to see Armenia through a very, very, very dark moment indeed. He's the Catholicos who reigns from just after the midpoint of the 7th century to 703, the start of the 8th. And so how did he initiate the 8th century after having had this very long kind of build up to the change? He was probably born in the 630s, And so he could remember Armenia prior to Islam. In himself, he embodies the politics and the theology of this time period from a practical point of view. His theology he put into charagans, many of which we still sing. His political ability to deal with Islam in its own terms made him a very fruitful negotiator on behalf of Armenia. And we'll mention in just a second why he was so familiar with Muslim culture and Arabic language. By his day, people younger than himself did not remember anymore what Armenia had been like. Islam was just a fact of life. The arrangement had already been made in 654, it was confirmed in 661, Armenians did well. And there was a honeymoon period in part because of this man. Well, you can't really see him anymore, this is just his tomb. But the Caliph at the turn of the century, a man named Muawiyah, was primarily occupied with wars elsewhere in Byzantine, North Africa, Bukhara, places like that. And in addition, his favorite wife, Maysun, was a Syrian Christian. So under him, Armenia had 20 years of peace. And so Sahak becomes Catholicos right at the end of that golden moment. Muawiyah dies in 680. This, as I said, is his tomb. The next Caliph is his son, Abd al-Malik, who you can see kind of sketchily there on the right. A man who renewed a standing peace treaty with the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, who you see on the left. And if Justinian's nose looks odd to you in this coin, and you wonder why the world would have allowed himself to be depicted like that, part of his claim to fame in the world was that his own soldiers cut his nose off. And so he had a substitute kind of silver sheath built and put where his nose should have been. And so part of the agreement between the two of them was that they are going to stop fighting with one another, and they're going to split the things over which they both want to have control, Cyprus, Armenia, Georgia. And to manage their interests in Armenia, the Muslim government appointed the Caliph's own brother, Muhammad, to become the governor of Armenia. And Muhammad is not a trusting man, and he doesn't care for Armenians very much. And so to ensure that the Armenians would behave themselves, he took prisoner Catholicos Sahak and the Prince of Armenia, Sambat Bagratuni, and carried them off to Damascus and imprisoned them there. The new governor is installed in Ervine, and Catholicos Sahak learned some Arabic. And Ervine, the center of the church, became thoroughly Islamized. And under Muhammad's governance, Muslim became much less friendly to their Armenians. He was a strict kind of guy, keep them down so that they don't put their heads up and rebel and do things like that. Well, of course, that doesn't work well with Armenians. And so there was a rebellion. And the rebellion caused great problems between the Islamic government of Muhammad and his brother and the Armenian nobility. So, Catholicos Sahak, after this rebellion begins, after his own return to Armenia, receives the terrible news that an Arab army is on its way to Armenia in order to quell the rebellion, if necessary, by killing a largest number of Armenian elite. The general of the army is Muhammad himself. The Catholicos knows that he is not coming with peaceful intent. The Catholicos knows that he is coming with in order to enact punitive measures, and that he's not going to look too carefully to see whether the people that he's punishing were actually involved in the rebellion or not. And so in his old age, as Sahak was thinking about what to do, what is the pastoral thing to do? What does the shepherd do for his flock in a case where he knows that there is imminent danger coming to them? And so he volunteered to go as an ambassador to Muhammad and to try and prevent the invasion from happening. And so as an older man, he makes the difficult journey into the Syrian desert. As far as he can tell, this is Haran, the place where Muhammad is going to stop before he enters Armenia. The Catholicos gets himself to Haran and he waits in order to have an interview, hopefully, with the general. And the person who tells us this story is the historian Ervine, who's writing 100 years later. And maybe he embroidered it a little, maybe he didn't, but it's a wonderful story in either case, and so I'm going to tell it to you. Muhammad the commander is delayed. The Catholicos becomes ill. The climate there is not wonderful. And he began to be afraid that he was going to die before he had a chance to present his case to Muhammad, in which case he would be dying in a foreign place for no reason. And so, fearing that this indeed was going to happen, the Catholicos wrote a letter to Muhammad to be given to him should he die prior to the general's arrival. And the letter said, "You have come to kill the innocent in revenge for the guilty. I tell you, if you slaughter my innocent sheep, may their blood bring their shepherd's curse on your head and on the heads of your family to the 7th generation." And those of you who speak Arabic will note the Arabic curse. "But if you do justice and right and keep back your hand from my sheep, their shepherd's blessing be with you and all your house." And as it happened, the Catholicos did die before the general arrived. And when Muhammad came into the city, people told him that the Armenian Catholicos had been waiting to see him and had recently died. In fact, he was still laid out awaiting burial. They gave the letter to the general, who read it and appreciated the bravery of the man who wrote it. That knowing he was facing arguably the world's most powerful man at that moment, he put his own life in danger in order to save his sheep. And so Muhammad asked where the Catholicos was being prepared for burial. He went to the chapel where he was laid out, took the corpse's hand, and in the presence of witnesses, promised, after saying some nice words about the letter and how much he appreciated it, "I promise you," he said, "that I will leave your sheep in peace for the next 7 years." He turned around, left the chapel, took his army home. 7 years and a day later, he would be back. And when he came back, he collected all of the pro-Byzantine Armenian nobility that he could find in 2 churches in Nakhichevan, sent messengers to their families requiring ransom money for their release, and upon receipt of the money, burned the churches with the nobility inside them. The churches later became known as the Mukhtarika churches, the churches that were burned. And in a way, this incident, or this nexus of incidents, Armenian discontent with Islam, bringing up a rebellion, causing a riposte against it by the Islamic State, cut off by the Catholicos for a time. This kind of nexus of incidents sets the tone for the 8th century. And so next time what we will be doing is looking at its unfolding, looking at what I've chosen to call the end of the beginning of Islamic rule in Armenia. The time when the honeymoon is finally over and the business of living with one another for Armenians and Muslims long term has begun. So, thank you. Arpi?
Thank you, Dr. Ervine. And thank you all for being patient with us.
Yes, we have a new tech setup.
Yeah, it's been great to play with different types of technology nowadays. So we're getting used to it. Please bear with us. So we do have a couple of questions. What were the relationships between the Catholicoi, competitive or supportive?
Yes, it depends entirely on whether the Catholicos' successor is also present during the Catholicos' life. There will be a time later when it was such a precarious question, Catholicos' succession, would it happen, would it not happen? The Catholicos began appointing their successor while they were still alive, having that person serve as a coadjutor with them for a while, and then take over uncontested without election after their death. But in this time period, it's very variable, and we are going to see several different ways that this could play out.
Thank you, Dr. Ervine. The next question is, did some Armenians convert to Islam to avoid paying taxes?
Armenians converted to Islam for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes vice versa. Next time we'll be looking at least one story of Armenian conversion to Islam, but there were many others. So yeah, as I said earlier, people are having to try and scope out the situation and see where they think the situation might be going. Are the Muslims here short term? Are they here long term? Are there advantages to becoming Muslim? Are there disadvantages to becoming Muslim? You know, how do you want to order the rest of your life in light of the circumstances on the ground? And so there are Armenians who are martyred in this time period for their faith. There are others who choose to convert instead. You have every possible option being followed. And then you have the intermarriages as well, so that you have, especially in the royal family of Osburagan, but not exclusively them, you have Armenian princes marrying Muslim princesses. Sometimes they convert to Christianity, sometimes they don't. The children kind of have to figure out their own identity.
Also,
Armenian women are also sent to marry into Islamic households for political alliance purposes. And just as you can imagine, if it were you or people that you know in this situation, there are as many different ways for this to play out as there are people.
Also, Dr. Ervine, why do you think Isaac of Tsoropol wrote his cross songs in this century? What political tension caused him to look to the powerful cross?
It depends on what time of you think he wrote them. Writing about the cross at any time for an Armenian Christian is a perfectly understandable thing to do. But if these songs were, if the Sharagans were written towards the end of his life, it would be quite understandable because he was watching clearly as Armenians once again found themselves on the road to crucifixion in various ways. And who knows exactly why people choose the things that they do to write about, but that at least we can speculate was part of his thinking. Since Armenians were going into a period where the cross was going to matter, and where many of them were going to have practical experience of it, writing those hymns would be an excellent thing.
We have two more questions. Who were the Muslims in Armenia, culturally, etc., at this time?
It's a mix, but most of it is Arab. from different parts of the Arabian Peninsula. That will change as the Islamic push for conversion spreads out into Asia. Very soon you're going to have the Turks, various types of Turks coming into the mix. You're going to have other peoples who step to the fore. You're going to have the caliphate power moving away from Arabs and into the hands of Egyptians, Turks, Kurds, and others. It's going to be a very mixed scene by the end of the time that we're talking about.
Dr. Ervine, this question goes back earlier in your presentation. Were these moving frontiers won through warfare or through caliphate decrees?
I'm sorry, say it again. I missed the first one.
These moving frontiers that you were talking about, were they won through warfare or through caliphate decrees?
Well, that's kind of a chicken and the egg question. Usually there's some kind of unrest that precipitates these things, and then the caliphate will recognize whatever is there, as long as it can make a rationale for itself that this is not going to be a harmful thing. As we'll see when we talk about the foundation of the Bagratid Kingdom and then the Kingdom of Vasco-da-Gama, there was a combination of, on the one hand, military movements by the Bagratids. There was also a recognition of the fact that they, either by marriage or by purchase or by takeover by some other method, had come to be massive landowners in the South Caucasus. And then there was also the question of their relationship to the Byzantine emperors, who at the time that the Bagratid Kingdom is set up are ethnically Armenian. So there was a whole lot of different things that played into that exact moment when the Bagratids seized their opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Ervine. These are the questions that we received, and Father Garabet just sent one more. Will you be discussing the Pakraduni Armenians and their kindred Georgians?
Yes, we will. Yes, we will. One of the great things about the Bagratids, one of their great advantages in political life actually had nothing to do with their politics and everything to do with their fertility. They were a child-rich family and reproduced well enough to be able to place their relatives in all kinds of useful situations. Some of those situations are later going to backfire, but still they could reach anywhere and everywhere. Unlike the Mamidonians, who were seriously challenged in that department. Like, we lost a lot of influence simply because they ran out of manpower. Or woman power, I'm sorry. Either way.
On that note, thank you everyone for joining. Dr. Ervine, thank you again for this wonderful and informative conversation, discussion, and lecture. And once again, we will not be meeting next week. We will be meeting on the 18th. And the missed week, we will be doing it at the end of the series. So we will send a reminder through the seminary. So thank you, and we hope that you have a great night. Kisher pari polorim.
Thank you all.